Well, good afternoon. I'm excited to be here today to participate on this panel. I want to thank the Heartland Institute once again for inviting me to speak and for all the incredible work that they're doing in this fight over or against climate alarmism. I truly applaud and appreciate their efforts. They're a wonderful organization and have made a significant difference in the critical battle over what to do or not do about rising anthropogenic CO2 emissions. Well, as you are aware, the topic of our current panel is fossil fuels and world peace. And for my presentation, I've been asked to highlight the historical relationship between carbon dioxide, climate, and social conflict. In prefacing my remarks, I would like to note that many political and opinion leaders feel it is important to enact legislation to limit carbon dioxide emissions out of concern that global warming is detrimental to society. High among their list of anxieties is the fear that CO2-induced global warming will lead to social unrest and perhaps even war, primarily as a result of postulated reductions in agricultural output followed by population turmoil due to lack of food. However, an emerging body of research suggests that these concerns are not only unfounded, but almost always backwards. It is global cooling from which society stands the most to lose. Global warming, by contrast, tends to promote social stability, as evidenced by the findings of multiple peer-reviewed papers, some of which I will discuss with you here today. Now, China is a good test case to begin highlighting this relationship between global warming and social stability because it has a well-populated, primarily agricultural country for millennia, and it has a relatively well-recorded history over this time period. Accordingly, several researchers have conducted analyses of factors influencing social stability in this part of the world. In a study of the widespread crises in China over the period 1600 to 1899, Li and Zhang, for example, found that both natural calamities and human catastrophes were clustered in periods of cold climate, primarily because cooling generates a devastating impact on agricultural production. Indeed, as shown in this slide, natural calamities and human catastrophes peaked during the colder climates of the 17th and 19th centuries, whereas during the relatively warm 18th century, agricultural production was enhanced, famines were abated, wars, rebellions, and epidemics were minimal, and population growth surged. Covering a broader temporal range of analysis, Zhang et al. Compared proxy climate records with historical data of Chinese wars, social unrest, and dynastic transitions from the mid-9th through the early 20th century and found similar results. War frequencies, peak war clusters, nationwide periods of social unrest, and dynastic transitions were all significantly associated with cold, not warm, phases of China's oscillating climate. More specifically, they report that all three distinctive peak war clusters, defined as more than 50 wars in a 10-year period, occurred during cold climate phases, as did all 7 periods of nationwide social unrest and nearly 90% of all dynastic changes that decimated this largely agrarian society. Thus, they conclude that climate change was one of the most important factors in determining the dynastic cycle and alteration of war and peace in ancient China, with warmer climates having been intensely more effective than cooler climates in terms of helping to keep the peace. And China is no different from the rest of the world in this regard. Focusing on the whole of Europe, for example, Toll and Wagner observed that periods with low temperatures in the pre-industrial era were accompanied by violent conflicts. Field and Lapp report that fortification construction is significantly correlated with periods of cooling throughout the inhabited regions of the tropical Pacific. Periods of warmth, in contrast, generally correlate with more peaceful times and epochs of less warfare. And studying the African Sahel, Benjaminson et al. Say that comparison of climate and conflict data gives little substance to claims that climate variability is an important driver of these conflicts, which finding they ultimately concluded presents evidence that land use conflicts in this region are shaped by political and economic factors as opposed to climate variability. Additional evidence that global cooling is far more prone to cause civil strife than global warming comes from the study of Kobe et al., analyzing data from all countries of the world over the recent 1980 to 2004 time period. The team of 4 researchers report that climate variability measured as deviations in temperature and precipitation from their past, does not affect violent intrastate conflict. In commenting on this finding, they say it is important because the causal pathway leading from climate variability via deteriorating economic growth to conflict is a key part of most theoretical models of the climate conflict nexus. Similar results were obtained by Zhang et al., who performed time series analyses to examine the association between temperature change and population collapses in different regions and climatic zones of the Northern Hemisphere, focusing on all known population collapses over the period 800 to 1900 AD. In addition, they computed regressions to estimate the relative sensitivity of population growth in the Northern Hemisphere to climatic change, where the independent variables employed were time and temperature anomalies. Well, their results indicate that of the 88 Northern Hemisphere population collapses identified, fully 80% of them were caused by cooling, while 12% occurred during what the six scientists called mild conditions, and only 8% of them were caused by warming. Thus, for the Northern Hemisphere as a whole, it is no surprise that they discovered temperature was positive and highly significant in the regressions in which a 10% increase in temperature produced an average of 3.1% increase in population growth rate. In another large-scale study, Slettebak examined whether natural disasters can add explanatory power to an established model of civil conflict. Results indicated that they can, but that their effect of conflict is the opposite of popular perception. That is to say, Slettebak specifies, quote, to the extent that climate-related natural disasters affect risk of conflict, they contribute to reducing it, end quote. And this result holds for a measure of climate-related natural disasters in general, as well as drought in particular, which findings they say are consistent with a large amount of research on the relation between disasters and the risk of antisocial behavior, stretching all the way back to the work of Fritz, conducted in 1961. Lastly, I want to highlight the work of Gartsky, who explored the relationship between interstate conflict, climate change, and processes fueled by industrialization, such as development, democracy, and international institutions. Based on his analysis, Gartsky's work further confirms that global warming is associated with a reduction in interstate conflict. What is more, he notes that incorporating measures of development, democracy, cross-border trade, and international institutions reveals that systemic trends towards peace are actually best accounted for by the increase in international income, which in turn is driven by the processes that are widely seen by experts as responsible for global warming. Now, how ironic is that? Did you see the irony? Recognizing as much, Gartsky continues by writing that stagnating economic development and middle income states caused by efforts to combat climate change could actually realize fears of climate-induced warfare. And thus he concludes that we must add to the advantages of economic development as it appears to make countries more peaceful. And we must therefore ask ourselves if environmental objectives should be modified by the prospect that combating climate change could prolong the process of transition from warlike to peaceful polities. Now, considering the findings presented in each of these studies I just cited, plus those revealed in a number of other studies not discussed here, but which you can find and read about on my CO2 Science website, in our subject index under the topical heading of War and Social Unrest, it is clear that concerns over potential future increases in civil strife due to CO2-induced global warming are unsupported in the scientific literature. In fact, empirical data confirm that the reality is just the opposite of the climate alarmist projections. What is more, ironically, there are legitimate reasons to conclude that rising atmospheric CO2 will actually help to alleviate social unrest in the future. So how will that be accomplished? Well, the answer starts with an op-ed published by Jimmy Carter a number of years ago entitled "To Cultivate Peace, We Must First Cultivate Food." Therein, the former U.S. president wrote, "When the Cold War ended in 1989, we expected an era of peace, but instead we got a decade of war." And then asking why peace had been so elusive, he answered that most of the past century's wars were fueled by poverty in developing countries whose economies depend on agriculture, but which lack the means to make their farmland productive. This fact, he continued, suggests an obvious but often overlooked path to peace, which is raise the standard of living of the millions of rural people who live in poverty by increasing agricultural productivity. His argument being that thriving agriculture is the engine that fuels broader economic growth and development, thus paving the way for prosperity and peace. One way to boost agricultural production and thereby promote the cause of peace is to fertilize the atmosphere with carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide, one of the major end products of the combustion process that fuels the engines of industry and transportation, is the very elixir of life. It is the major building block of all plant tissues, playing an essential role in the photosynthetic process that sustains nearly all of Earth's vegetation, which in turn sustains nearly all of the planet's animal life. And as with any production process, the insertion of more raw materials, in this case CO2, into the production line results in more manufactured goods coming out of the other end, which in the case of the plant growth production line is biosphere-sustaining food. And as President Carter stated in his op-ed, leaders of developing nations must make food security a priority, for there can be no peace until people have enough to eat, thus allowing the CO2 content of the air to increase so as to boost agricultural production is one method by which that objective can be achieved. Within this context, a few years ago I developed and analyzed a study of supply and demand of food scenario for the year 2050. More specifically, I prepared estimates of regional and global food supplies derived for the year 2050, both including and not including the well-known yield-enhancing effects of rising atmospheric CO2 on food plants. That is expected to occur over the next few decades. And I then compared those results with the food needs of the human population that is expected to be inhabiting the planet at that future date. This exercise revealed that a very real and devastating food crisis is looming on the horizon, and that continuing advancements in agricultural technology and expertise will most likely not be able to bridge the gap between global food supply and global food demand just a few short years from now. However, the positive impact of Earth's rising atmospheric CO2 concentration on crop yields will considerably lessen the severity of the coming food shortage. In some regions and countries, it will mean the very difference between being food secure and food insecure, and it will aid in lifting untold hundreds of millions out of a state of hunger and malnutrition, preventing starvation and premature death. Now, those findings suggest that the world's food security envisioned by President Carter is precariously dependent upon the continued rising of the air's CO2 concentration, and the benefits of that rise have been aptly characterized by the leader of modern-day crop CO2 enrichment research, Dr. Sylvan H. Whitwer, who stated, "The rising level of atmospheric CO2 could be the one global natural resource that is progressively increasing food production and total biological output in a world of otherwise diminishing natural resources of land, water, energy, minerals, and fertilizer. It is a means of inadvertently increasing the productivity of farming systems and other photosynthetically active ecosystems. The effects know no boundaries, and both developing and developed countries are and will be sharing equally." Well, Norman Borlaug, the father of the Green Revolution and 1970 Nobel Peace Prize recipient, has also written about the need to vastly increase the world's agricultural productivity. In an article he published at the turn of the 21st century, he described the very real problem of food shortages facing the world in the not too distant future, noting it took some 10,000 years to expand food production to the current level of about 5 billion tons per year. And in order to meet the needs of the growing population of the planet, we will have to nearly double the current production again within a very few short decades. However, Dr. Borlaug saw some ominous forces at work that could keep society from achieving that goal, specifically citing those that array themselves against the genetic engineering of agricultural crops. "Extremists in the environmental movement," he wrote, "seem to be doing everything they can to stop scientific progress in its tracks, stating that the platform of the antibiotechnology extremists, if it were to be adopted, would have grievous consequences for both the environment and humanity." In addition, he lamented the fact that some scientists, many of whom should or do know better, have also jumped on the extremist environmental bandwagon in search of research funds. What is striking about Dr. Borlaug's words is how well they also describe the situation faced with respect to the ongoing rise in the air's CO2 concentration. He talked, for example, about the unsubstantiated scaremongering done by opponents of genetic engineering, which is amazingly similar to the unsubstantiated scaremongering done by climate alarmists, who would deny the world the incredible agricultural benefits of the aerial fertilization effect of atmospheric CO2. Nowhere, Dr. Borlaug wrote, is it more important for knowledge to confront fear born of ignorance than in the production of food. It is disappointing that this agricultural aspect of the global change debate is almost never broached. As Dr. Borlaug states, agricultural scientists and leaders have a moral obligation to warn political, educational, and religious leaders about the magnitude and seriousness of the arable land, food, and population problems that lie ahead, even with breakthroughs in biotechnology. In fact, if we fail to do so, as he described it, we will be negligent in our duty and inadvertently may be contributing to the pending chaos of incalculable millions of deaths by starvation. Imagine the civil strife and conflict that would follow. Global food insecurity will not disappear without new technology, Borlaug concluded, and as I have shown in my own study of the subject, it will be next to impossible to meet the challenge of feeding Earth's population just a few short decades from now without a continuation of the ongoing rise in the air's CO2 content, which rise will thankfully boost agricultural production and foster global food security, thus helping to pave the way for future global prosperity and peace. CO2-induced global warming is not leading, nor will it lead, to increased incidences of social unrest and war. Rather, future warming, if it is to occur, in conjunction with the very real and measurable benefits expected by continuing atmospheric CO2 enrichment, will help to foster social stability and peace. And it is time for the true deniers to wake up and face the facts. For far too long now, they have besmirched and defamed the many virtues of carbon dioxide. Atmospheric CO2 is not a pollutant. It is the very elixir of life. Thank you.